Good morning to folks who are joining us on Zoom as well. Hit and share screen here. Alright. There. How's everybody doing this much cooler Friday? Good, hopefully. Okay. Alrighty, I'm gonna do attendance out loud, just, a couple more times. I've got about half of you just checking you in, but I want to make sure I do it right. So Mia, I saw, and Kaylin, and Ella, Bryn, and Caitlin, is she here today? I don't see her. Double check, she's, nope, not on there. Abby? Okay. And Lauren is online, and so is Elijah. Ayana, I saw. Jordan? Okay. And Aishia? Yeah, all right. Deshaun is not here. Naya, I saw. Olivia, I saw. Emma? Okay, Emma. I'm like trying to associate it. Rowan, I saw come in. Didn't see Daryl. Gabby? Gabriella? Okay. And then Connor. Not here. Okay. Is there anyone's name I didn't call? Just double checking now that we're into the first week and a half. Cool. And like I said, probably by this time next week, I won't have to do that. I can just check y'all in because I'm almost there. So, alrighty. Today, we're going to continue with this lecture. Depending on how long it takes us, we have an activity we might do as well. But if we don't get to that, we can do it Monday. I'm very flexible about what we cover when in this class, just because sometimes we really get discussions going and it goes really well, and other days we're all tired. Let's be honest. So, alrighty. So we were just talking about, oh, and let me do this real quick. That's actually something I should say. I now have uploaded all the videos so far. I got caught up on those. So I'll just show you where those are on Blackboard real quick. After I do my single sign on. Oh, come on. Oh. So if you go to courses and you go to our course, you'll see recordings of class down here. And then I've just linked us to our YouTube playlist for this class. So once it loads, you'll see all the videos of all the classes so far. So if you miss a day, or if I talk too fast, which happens sometimes, and you want to go back, then they're all right here. And the reason I wanted to make sure I turned on the Zoom captions is I forgot until I was uploading yesterday that if I use the Zoom captions, it saves them, and then I can upload it to YouTube as closed captioning. YouTube used to automatically close caption everything, and they stopped, which was really obnoxious. Because I always try to strive for as much accessibility as I can get. So this is a way I can do that. Alrighty, so we were talking about facts and what they mean. Try to just move this a little so y'all can see. Oh, and it's all good for people trying to sign on. Yeah, the school Wi-Fi hasn't been working for me in my office, so I can do my work. So that's lovely. Hopefully it gets better. Alrighty, so we had been talking through these facts, and the one we left off on was that the span of a human short-term memory is 7 plus or minus 2. So you guys learned this in like intro or things like that. And so what we used to think is this meant you could remember if I just gave you a list of words, numbers, letters that are related, you could remember somewhere between 5 and 9. Well, what we figured out with sort of more modern technology changed a little bit. And like it's actually maybe more like 3 to 5 items. So for example, when I do my single sign-on, like I just had to, it's 6 numbers, but I do what's called chunking. I make so they make them 2. I like put the first 3 together and then the second 3 together. It's kind of like, I don't know if you all have this experience because I don't anymore. But back in the day, we had to memorize people's phone numbers because they weren't just at our cell phone. I don't know anyone's phone number anymore. My husband's because he's like 4 digits away from mine, but that's it. And so I would chunk that, right? Someone's number is the area code, the first 3, the last 4. So it's much easier to remember than remembering all those numbers. And then what does the fact mean that there are genetic aspects to mental disorder? Anorexia is one example, but depression we've known as genetic really since the ancient Greeks. They figured that out. What's the implications of that? What does that mean in terms of people who get it, how we treat it, how we look at or stigmatize or not people who have these disorders? So if we can, do you have something, Bryn? Go ahead. Exactly, and that's one of the goals, just like, are people familiar with the BRCA gene for breast cancer? So the BRCA gene is, if you have it, if your family has it, you are much more likely to get breast cancer. So kind of similar to what Bryn was just talking about, women who find out they have that, they don't have to, but they can elect to undergo a double mastectomy. And some even get their like lymph nodes over here removed too, to prevent that. And they could choose to be reconstructive surgery or not. But yeah, that maybe we can do something like that for mental disorders down the road and prevent them before they even start. To me, this is like, oh, did you have something, Maya? Okay. To me, this also says like, we've often blamed mental illness on the person themselves, or let's be honest, if we go back to Freud, on their mother, right? And in fact, this says these might be as biological as having, you know, type 1 diabetes or, you know, other genetically based disorders. And to me, that should hopefully give more empathy, seeing it more as a medical diagnosis instead of something you can just fix. You know, people would tell my eating disorder clients that I saw, well, just eat. You'll be fine, just eat. And like, it's nearly impossible when you look at a plate of food and you translate that in your mind to, this is immediately going to make me fat. I had a client who had insulin dependent diabetes, and the way that she would, her compensatory mechanism basically is she wouldn't take her insulin because insulin helps you actually digest and keep the calories in the food. And she saw her insulin as injecting fat into her body. Okay, that's like life-saving, right? So hopefully we'll get to the point where people realize it's not just, you know, oh, go take a walk and your depression will be cured. It'll probably help a little, but you're gonna need much more than that. Okay, thanks, Connor, for letting me know your username. That's really helpful. Check you off right here. And again, these are just a couple facts, right? And there are so many that we just take to mean they're actually facts. And so right here is what I was just referencing in terms of short-term memory, that the idea is that we used to think it was, you know, 5 to 9, 7 plus or minus 2. And this article came out in 2000, which is so interesting to me and really shows how bad we are at disseminating science, because I started college in 2000. I got my PhD in 2010. I did not know this had changed until I did the reading about it myself 2 years ago. right? So like, we're really bad at getting information out to the people who are teaching it, the people who are writing the textbooks, right, things along those lines. But the idea is that our short-term memory storage might not be as good as we thought it was. And so science is always changing as we get updated facts and better ways of studying things, updated technology, things along those lines. And this is that article, so it is linked if anyone does want to read it. And what they found is they used young adults, would be people y'all's age, and it's really more like 3 to 5 items. And that we should keep that in mind when we're, teaching people things, trying to get them to do certain things. Another thing we talk about, and I have a shirt that illustrates exactly this example on the screen, but I couldn't find it this morning, so it must be in the wash. But correlation is not equal causation. We say that a lot in psych. What does that really mean? Does anyone know? Can anyone actually explain that in people terms? Yeah.
Not sure, but because something is that is what it's all.
Exactly. I'm going to show this video and then we'll kind of like explain it a little more. But this video is a really nice illustration of that.
As explained in another video, we calculate the correlation coefficient for 2 variables to determine not only if the 2 variables move in the same direction, but also how strong the relationship is. However, as a famous phrase tells us, correlation does not imply causation. In other words, 2 variables might indeed move in the same direction and the relationship may be quite strong, but this doesn't mean we can draw a, let's say, cause and effect conclusion, with changes with respect to one variable causing changes for the other. In other words, the correlation coefficient can tell us that 2 variables clearly move in the same direction, but it doesn't tell us why. A pretty popular example is represented by ice cream sales being correlated with homicides in New York. Yes, statisticians may very well have noticed that when ice cream sales go up, homicides do the same, and when ice cream sales go down, homicides go down. But that doesn't mean ice cream makes people kill one another. In quite a few cases, we're simply talking about coincidences, even if the correlation coefficient is robust. Or, of course, there can be hidden factors at play. In our situation, we can take a step back and notice that the weather is the hidden factor which affects both ice cream sales and homicides. Simply put, more people buy ice cream when it's sunny outside on the one hand, and more people go out when it's sunny on the other and end up representing potential homicide victims. To put it differently, ice cream sales and homicides may be correlated, but there is no causal relationship there, whereas there is a causal relationship between the weather and ice cream sales, as well as between the weather and homicides. Pretty logical, right?
So that's sort of the classic example. You can do the same thing with ice cream and shark attacks because they both go up in the summer. And we'll like play with this site more later in the semester. But I wanted to show you this awesome site where if this sort of like gets you thinking about things, you can kind of play with it. This is not the site I was looking for. There's a illusory correlation site that actually lets you look at, let me try this, just type interactive. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to find it right now, but I'll show it. If you Google illusory correlation enough, you're going to find it. But where you can actually like look at some of these crazy different things. Oh, you know what? I think they might call it like I think they use more technical terms. Let's see. Spurious. Yeah, I sure did mean spurious correlations. There we go. Aha. So these are some other things that seem to correlate but don't cause each other. How much we spend on space and technology with suicides, specifically by hanging. This is one of my favorites, Nicolas Cage films and the number of people who drown by falling into a pool. Like, if this was causal, we'd be like, Nicolas cheese and being tangled in your bed sheets, the divorce rate in Maine, and consumption of margarine rather. And there is, I think if you scroll all the way down here, there are some fun interactive things you can do with it. Math after it's awarded, and then how much uranium is stored, you know, just sort of silly things like that. And the reason why we say this every psych class and why this is particularly important in this class is because a lot of times when the media gets a hold of a science story, they will say, oh, studies are out say that today that say that eating chocolate causes you to live longer. And meanwhile, it was like a correlational study, right? They didn't randomly assign one group to eat chocolate and one group not to eat chocolate, right? And so part of being an informed consumer is realizing those things.
As explained,
Interesting things that your book talks about that I thought sort of was interesting is this idea of the half-life of facts from journals. And so your book says the half-life of facts is about 45 years. But like for me, I was like, kind of, what does that mean? So I found a pretty good video about it.
My name is Sam Arbesman. I'm a senior scholar at the Kauffman Foundation. I'm the author of The Half-Life of Facts. Turns out people have actually been quantifying the half-life of knowledge within medicine and other areas. I realized that maybe there's something to this. There's this larger issue of understanding how knowledge grows, how it spreads, how it becomes overturned over time, how we deal with knowledge. There is a regularity to how knowledge changes, and hopefully that's the kind of thing that can provide a certain amount of comfort to people. I think it also is really exciting that knowledge is changing, and that should be exhilarating. I think within the scholarly world, people already know at least a little bit about the idea that knowledge is being overturned. Maybe not consciously, but intuitively or subconsciously, they know that the vast majority of the papers they publish are not going to stand the test of time. This is just the way knowledge works. But then as we grow older, we might see that, oh, we read in the paper, red wine is now good for us versus bad for us, or dinosaurs look totally different from what we learned when we were younger. And that can be a little disconcerting. And so the point of the book is to say to a broader audience that, first of all, knowledge changes. That's just the way of the world.
One thing real quick about, they showed the T-Rex skeleton, and that's how I always saw T-Rex skeletons going up with the roots kind of stopping here. And then in recent years, they've discovered, you know, just like we have ribs that start from our spine and go here. They also keep going around to the front, and they discovered the front ribs of T-Rexes. And T-Rexes were much girthier than we thought they were. They were a little like, I want to say chubby, but they were curvy. Right? So like our knowledge is always changing. Another funny thing that you can look up is people asking artists to design what a animal might look like just based on its skull. And so if you give someone like a hippo skull and you tell them this is a dinosaur skull, it ends up looking terrifying. And so we're probably not taking into account all the tissue that was attached to those bones, right? So we're forever learning new knowledge, finding new discoveries, things along those lines.
But if you can understand the order and the regularity to how knowledge changes, that can actually provide a way of structuring and ordering all the knowledge that's around you and all the facts that we're just constantly inundated with. Science is constantly in draft form. We always know that things are subject to re-examination, experimentation, and testing. Core scientific knowledge, the stuff that makes it into our textbooks, the really fundamental things, like that an atom has electrons, or that DNA is the material of genetics. These kinds of things we're pretty certain are correct, like the number of continents that are on the planet. Learn those once, you're done. But then there's all the stuff that's constantly being discovered and published on a weekly or daily basis. That's the frontier knowledge. That stuff is constantly in flux. There have been a lot of really rapid changes in knowledge since the dawn of the scientific revolution. There were some things that were big deals, like the theory of evolution. That was a pretty big deal. That rocked Victorian society. But we bounced back. There's actually an economist at Harvard University. He refers to how knowledge and new ideas become accepted, where the pace is what he calls it's crazy, crazy, crazy obvious. And I think a lot of overturning of facts is the same
Very
kind of way.
accurate.
You need to really look at all of knowledge in the aggregate, because the truth is we can't predict which specific discovery is going to occur or which fact is going to be overturned. There's only meaning in looking at all the facts together and saying, okay, if we look at all the facts within a field of medicine and then look to see how many of them are still true a number of decades later, only then can we calculate.
So just real quick, if you're not familiar with the history of medicine, once upon a time, they really did think that applying leeches to suck out your blood would balance your humors and therefore make you better. They would also just bleed people, often like sort of cut them right here and just collect a bowl of blood. I can't imagine, right? But to them, that made sense. These were also the same people who, when germ theory was developed, were like, what do you mean there are like things we can't see on our hands that we can transmit between our patients? Like doctors weren't washing their hands and they rejected this idea. Crazy, crazy, crazy obvious, right? The other examples they gave are more from psych. So I thought it was good to take a second to look at those. Electroshock therapy, we actually do still use today, called CT or electroconvulsive therapy. We do it in a much more safe way. So yes, they still run shocks through your brain and basically purposely give you a seizure, but they give you muscle relaxants, they restrain you, so you're not doing what people used to do and like dislocating your shoulder, things along those lines. We do this, and we've been doing it for like a century, and yet we still don't know why it works. The best analogy we've come up with is like when you call IT and they're like, have you tried turning it off and turning it back on? Right? Like you're not totally turning the brain off, but you're kind of restarting it. And then the last thing they mentioned was lobotomies. I'm so sorry if any of you are squeamish. It's a little early in the morning, but we gotta talk about it because this is very much from psych's history. This is a surgery where, or I guess a procedure, where they would go in initially through the eye sockets. I think eventually they did through the nose. And basically, the first one was an actual ice pick from the guy who came up with this freezer. And they just kind of rammed it up into your frontal lobe and mashed it around. And then patients would be much more compliant and gentle. Well, yeah, they would, because you mashed up their frontal lobe, which does things like personality and emotion, right? But for years we thought these were the way to treat things, right? And a lot of people were lobotomized. And it's really unfortunate. But they didn't think it was cruel and unusual. They genuinely thought they were helping people.
Some sort of half-life or understanding of how knowledge changes. If we're taught at a young enough age that you shouldn't view your education as a done deal. You're being given the tools to think and to understand the world. We're giving you the skills to begin to continue to assimilate new knowledge and new ideas. If we can teach that, that could be really, really liberating for a lot of people. There's an order and a regularity to how knowledge changes, and understanding that can actually give you a certain amount of hope and a way of ordering the world around you.
Yeah, and I just love the subtitle of that book. Everything we know has an expiration date, right? Like, we're gonna always be finding new knowledge. I mean, just the idea, my husband and I try to think, again, our daughter is 5 years old, she just started kindergarten. What is it gonna be like for her when she's college age, or she's our age in her 40s? Like, we can't even wrap our heads around, right? So like when our parents were our age, there were no cell phones, and they were like just coming up with computers that would have taken up this whole room, right? So just the idea that like this now has more computing power than the mode of transportation they took to the moon on the Apollo missions is boggling, right? And it fits in my pocket. And we have 2 of them in our home because we each have one, and then we have all these other little computers, right? So things are going to change and develop, even though sometimes it feels like, well, we're at the pinnacle, we found everything. I don't know, maybe you'll just have like a contact lens you wear, right? And that's your cell phone with a little earpiece. I don't know. Who knows what we're going to come up with next, right? Alrighty. So the next one, we're going to talk about a fact related to a very violent case, so just a trigger warning that this will mention sexual assault, violence, and murder. So if those are problematic for anybody, please feel free to step out. Get a Loki ad, apparently.
I'm not going anywhere if I get some apple pie.
America was riveted this week by the upsetting case of Brock Turner, the Stanford University swimmer who was convicted of a rape of an unconscious woman and was sentenced to only 6 months in jail. If there was anything at all positive about this story, it was the fact that the crime was discovered and halted by two heroic Stanford students from Sweden. Carl Frederick Arndt and Peter Johnson were cycling past when they saw the crime being committed, and when Turner tried to flee, they
I'm just gonna, we have two sets of captions and it's
tackled and
overwhelming
pinned
for
him
me.
down
So.
until police arrived and arrested him. Their heroics in apprehending the Stanford rapist reminded me of a famous murder case 50 years ago that came to symbolize a world where people didn't care when bad things happened and they didn't get involved. To this day, it remains the subject of psychological studies. But it turns out the story is more complicated than we were led to believe. At about 3 a.m. on March 13, 1964, 28-year-old Kitty Genovese was brutally stabbed to death outside her apartment building in Kew Gardens in the borough of Queens, New York. In a front-page story, the New York Times reported that 37 witnesses either saw or heard the attack. The headline said they saw it, and not one lifted a finger. But now comes a documentary called The Witness, the work of Kitty's younger brother, Bill, he was 16 at the time, and filmmaker James Solomon. And their work, 11 years in the making, reveals that history got this one wrong.
When my mom tried to open the door, it hit Kitty. And she was facing her head towards the door, her feet towards the stairs. And my mother had to push the door in to get in. She held her and she could feel the stab wounds in her back. And her hands kept going, still fighting. And my mom finally calmed her down. But she couldn't talk and she started to gurgle. That was her. She was just passing then. She was dying. So, hours later, I opened the door and the whole bottom of this foyer was blood.
Joining me now, Bill Genovese and James Solomon. So, Bill, what did history get wrong?
Michael, the most shocking thing that history got wrong was 2 weeks after Kitty's murder, there was a front-page New York Times article which started out describing the situation this way. 38 people watched over the course of a half an hour and did nothing. 38 people did not watch. The attack took place in 2 different phases. One was on Austin Street and the other was in the back of apartments. It did take place over 32 minutes, something like that. But 38 people certainly did not watch.
Well, and they
over
didn't
that
stand
time span.
idly by, because we just showed the clip. Michael Farrar's mother,
Right.
Sophia Farrar, I don't want to give it all away, but you interview her in a very poignant scene in the movie. Your sister died in her arms.
That's right. But of course, it was over the course of 32 minutes, and when Sophia Farrar first found out, it was at the end of her life. It was after the second attack, which was really the fatal attack.
Was this done then to sell newspapers? I have the headline in my hand, 37 who saw murder didn't call the police.
Some have said that. I myself don't believe that. I think that A.M. Rosenthal thought he had an important moral story to tell and got it out that way. The police chief at that time was talking to A.M., who had come back from overseas. He was now the city editor. He wanted to get to know the city a little better, and the police chief said to him, problem the police are having? Citizens aren't cooperating. Then later on, he said, wait till you hear this one. And he told him the story is, he knew it, of 38 people watching.
James, in the movie, there's a line that Bill delivers when he says, my sister was so much more than her final 30 minutes. And we're showing images of Kitty Genovese as we're speaking. Right. The home movies were priceless and an integral part in telling the story of who she was.
Well, that's Bill and Kitty's Uncle Andy. He was a gadget guy in the 50s, and he...
So they're just going to talk a little more about the documentary, but the idea that this has been a story sort of enshrined in American culture. I remember, so I did public speaking forensics when I was in high school, and I was decent at it. I think it built a lot of skills I use now. Like sometimes I'm like, oh, I remember I got those gestures. But I remember my biggest competition the year that I did the one where you basically just come up with an oral argument was man, I guess boy at that point, we were like 16, 17, who did his about apathy. He started with the Kenny Genevieve story. So it was like really in the culture. And at that point, the fact that like people did help him, like multiple people did try to call the police, didn't come out until then. So yeah, this is just a story that, again, not maliciously, but people just got wrong. Oxytocin has for years been thought to be this love hormone, or like this link to bonding and trust. And because it's brain related, whenever something's related to the brain or like other sort of higher forms of science, right? Like there's a reason we say, oh, it's not brain surgery, it's not rocket science, because we respect some sciences and some disciplines more than others, right? People, if you tell someone it's in the brain, they tend to believe it, right? And so this is a little video about that.
Welcome to 2 Minute Neuroscience, where I explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, we'll discuss oxytocin. Oxytocin is a peptide hormone and a neuropeptide, which is a name for a peptide that can also act as a neurotransmitter. Oxytocin is primarily produced in the hypothalamus and transported through axons to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. From there, it can be secreted into the bloodstream of the body. Although there are a number of effects linked to this peripherally acting oxytocin, the best understood effects have to do with childbirth and breastfeeding. Oxytocin is involved with increasing uterine contractions during labor and with the milk letdown reflex, which causes milk to be released during breastfeeding.
So this is why if you've ever watched or read anything about childbirth and you've heard of Pitocin being used to induce labor, it mimics oxytocin, and that's why they use it. I got to experience the joys of Pitocin when they induced my labor. It creates crazy contractions. Like I wouldn't have one for 15 minutes and then I'd have two within 5 minutes. Not fun.
There's also evidence, however, that some oxytocin-containing neurons project to other areas of the central nervous system, including the hippocampus, cerebral cortex, brainstem, amygdala, and spinal cord. The effects of this centrally released oxytocin are not as clearly understood. Some research suggests it is involved with trust, empathy, and social bonding. These findings have caused some to call oxytocin the trust hormone, the love hormone, or even the cuddle hormone. Others have argued, however, that oxytocin's effects on the brain are not so clear-cut. Some researchers have found oxytocin to be associated with negative emotions and aggression, and some of the research supporting oxytocin's function as a love or trust hormone has been criticized for methodological problems. Other researchers have hypothesized that oxytocin might be involved in promoting responsiveness to social cues in general, whether they be positive or negative. Thus, at this point, there is no consensus on the effects of oxytocin's actions on behavior. It is likely, however, that its effects on behavior are far more complex than a simple designation like the love hormone would suggest.
So again, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means
Welcome to 2 Minute
there's a
Neuroscience.
lot more complexity than we think of, right? All right. And so I really like this in your book, how they have questions that we should ask when we're thinking about scientific literacy, when we're questioning a belief. And we're going to talk and actually like look at how to figure out what online is fake or not. I mean, you guys probably know a lot of it already, but there's some other fun ways you can look at it. But here's an example fact that unfortunately is still going around the internet. COVID is a hoax, right? Well, the idea is under scientific literacy, you wouldn't just take that at face value. You would use these options. So is the belief based on unsubstantiated claims? Yeah. Unfortunately, I've had COVID twice. It's a real thing. And even vaccinated, it sucks. Right? So, and unfortunately, millions of people, maybe billions of people have it worldwide, and millions of people have died. Over 1 million just in the US alone. Right, I think like to this day, we haven't let ourselves process that. And there's gonna be a day when we look back and realize we lost 1 million people, and we're gonna be like, oh, that's one of the reasons why we don't have a workforce anymore. And we'll have grief, I mean, as I mentioned the other day, I was alive during 9/11. And it had such a profound effect on me, even though I didn't know anybody who was personally affected. So I think when we stop and think about, and 5,000 people died, and I definitely don't want to diminish that, right? But if we stop and think about over 1 million Americans alone dying, it's gonna be overwhelming, right? When we finally allow ourselves to do that. Kind of related here to the belief rely on norms and assumptions, but this kind of goes to like the deep state stuff, right? That like the whole government is just trying to pull a fast one on us. This is also where some of the laws in like Florida and other places are coming out that, you can't teach this, you can't talk about that, because they think professors or teachers are gonna indoctrinate y'all. And I love the comments I've seen from like high school teachers, and they're like, if I could indoctrinate my students, they'd turn in their homework, right? Things a lot like we just don't have that much power, right? Nor do we want it, honestly. We want to instead get you all to think and question and be thinking about knowledge as a whole. Does it make sense? Well, no, right? We've seen the ravages of COVID. Do the measurements seem valid? They're not even using any type of measurement, right here. Where did the data come from, and is there an agenda? This is important. Even again, within well-meaning science, if you're funded by certain people, again, you as a scientist have the obligation to try to be as objective as possible, but it can still sway things, right? And so you need to be very careful about that. Will the results survive the trip from the lab to the outside world? This doesn't have a lab, right, to start from. And is there another way to explain the result? Yes, COVID exists, right? We've seen it. And honestly, this is looking at it from like an empathetic psychological perspective. Things like this come from people who are terrified and don't want it to be true, right? And so it feels better for them to believe a lie. All right. Acupuncture is an ancient practice that eliminates a host of issues. Now, this is a little more interesting because there are kind of studies both ways here. So just thinking about what you all have heard about acupuncture. What have you heard about acupuncture, how it works, if it works? Has anyone in here ever tried it? I haven't. Yeah, a couple of people have. Did you feel like it actually worked for you? Oh, yeah, a little bit of like a compound there. Yeah. Nice. Yeah, and did it last? Well, hey, I mean, that's like about what a massage lasts, so. Yeah, and I mean, there are things to this, right? So like those Dramamine things you can put behind your ears, right, or around your wrists, like they actually do make people less likely to get a seizure. Right, and so that's what we need to look at. It's like, what is the research saying? And I don't want to knock acupuncture in any way. I'm just going to show a video that talks a little bit about the research. And this is one of the ones that for whatever reason, the link, like if I embedded it, it didn't work, even though the video is still there.
Here's why he wasn't losing weight.
I was eating because I was stressed out, candy bars.
It doesn't matter where you stick the needles. It also doesn't matter if you stick the needles. What the evidence shows is that acupuncture is essentially an elaborate placebo. You get a placebo effect out of it, and that is all. You get no specific effect out of the acupuncture itself. Acupuncture.
This being said, one thing I want to stop and say is placebos could work for people, right? So if you're not actually physically harming someone and this is the placebo that works for you, go for it, I would say. I've even seen like MDs online talk about that, you know, hey, if you feel like this works for you, do it. But also to be careful, because unfortunately there are some people who don't know how to do it right. And because you are sticking needles in, if you like hit a nerve or something like that, you can actually cause damage. It's rare, right? But just like any other medical procedure, you need to know what you're doing.
Acupuncture, which is defined as inserting needles, acupuncture needles, into acupuncture points that are supposed to relate to the symptomatology, whatever symptoms you're trying to treat. The clinical research clearly shows, after literally thousands of studies, that it doesn't matter where you stick the needles. It also doesn't matter if you stick the needles. You could randomly poke somebody with toothpicks, and some studies literally do that, and that's just as effective as, you know, doing all the things that an acupuncturist is supposed to do. If they're equally effective, what does that mean? I interpret that to mean that acupuncture, sticking needles in acupuncture points, doesn't work because you don't have to do it. You don't have to stick the needle. Saying that acupuncture works because there is a placebo effect would be like a pharmaceutical company saying, well, our drug and the placebo worked better than no treatment at all in clinical trials. Therefore, both our drug and placebo work. It's not proper logic of science and evidence. It's not science-based medicine. The bottom line is, and we have thousands of studies now to demonstrate this, acupuncture doesn't work for any indication.
And so that's disappointing to some people, right, who have done acupuncture, feels like it works for them. And again, I come down a little bit differently than this guy. And I think that's because I come from, again, a clinical psych perspective rather than a neurological perspective. If it works and traditional medicine's not, if you feel better after getting acupuncture, then it's doing something maybe not physically, but psychologically for you, right? And let's keep doing it so people feel better. Like for some people with chronic pain, this is the only thing that works, right? You know, same thing with like some people have questioned whether cupping works or not. Some people have questioned other things as well, right? But again, if that person believes it works and they feel better afterwards and it's not harming them, especially if nothing else is working, let's go for it, right? Alrighty. This is a fun one. All right. Standing 6 feet apart will protect you from COVID. Does anyone know what this assumption was based on? No, I don't know. Exactly, it's droplets. So they assumed, just like most colds, that COVID was transmitted by sneezing and coughing, and that does stop at 6 feet. So like if I sneeze or cough, I wouldn't get anything, right? And so like a lot of people still believe that. But research is showing what? Does anyone know how COVID is actually transmitted? I'm not surprised that no one knows. It's an aerosol, which means that it comes out just when you breathe. And so, and this is not to terrify anybody or anything like that, but you know, if I'm standing here and I have it, Naya could get it from me. Because if it's an aerosol, it could go like the length of a football. Right? And so this whole idea that like 6 feet apart is going to protect you was actually undermined fairly early in the research, but this is the lovely stupid thing. There was some sort of, in like a flyer or a white paper at the CDC that said, in order for something to be an aerosol, it has to be like this small, and COVID was bigger than that. So they were saying it can't be an aerosol. Well, they tried to figure out when they were researching COVID, like, where did that idea come from? And they went back, and it was like sometime in the 50s or 60s, an intern like translated something from another document and it wasn't quite accurate. But then that had just lived on, and this happens with, again, very well-meaning people. And so that caused like a holdup in people acknowledging that COVID is airborne, that COVID is an aerosol. So is it based on unsubstantiated claims? I mean, at the time they thought no, right? At the time they thought it has to be a droplet. But when you dig in more, yeah. And it made sense, right? That's why this can be tricky sometimes. But then once we know it's an aerosol, 6 feet doesn't matter, unfortunately. All that helps is wearing a good quality mask, right? And the data, we didn't have data at the start of the pandemic, right? And so they just, again, went with data based on, okay, this is a coronavirus, which is like the common cold. The common cold is another type of a coronavirus, and that is droplets, right? So again, they weren't doing this maliciously. They were very well intentionally saying, these are the safety precautions that should help. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, them telling us not to mask, that it wouldn't help, right? And then that changed. Where did it come from? And is there an agenda? I think there's still an agenda. And I've kind of mentioned this in the past that they don't want people to panic. They want to try to protect the economy by people sort of going back to life as usual rather than being cautious. And unfortunately, these types of things get distorted. Going to the outside world. Is there another way to explain the results? Yeah, here, right? And so this article, again, you can find the link, is about specifically that 60-year-old little blip somewhere in a documentation at the CDC that led to all these delays in people realizing that COVID could be an aerosol. And these virologists were just working with the WHO and the CDC and saying, no, like, no, it is. And that just took forever for them to get people to realize that. And again, really sad for someone who's trying to just like help people, right? And so here is another video kind of talking briefly about that.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
In a new set of COVID guidelines, the government has highlighted the importance of well-ventilated spaces and stated that aerosol and droplet transmission are a risk. According to a document released by
And again, that being new, right? If you're not familiar, that's why I have this thing in the corner, which Dr. Stoley made, thank her. So this is a CR box. It's something you can make at home. It's just furnace filters and a fan, but it scrubs the air. And it costs, I don't know, like $40 as opposed to like a really good HEPA filter is like hundreds. And so in addition to masking, that's why I have this in here. This COVID should, in theory, create a revolution in how we look at air in buildings. So other professors have posted you can get little air quality monitors and like going into a lecture hall. And even if we weren't worried about COVID, just like the air quality is so poor, the levels of CO2 are so high that like we should be thinking more just for general public health about having better ventilation in buildings, right? Unfortunately, because it's very cost prohibitive, right? People haven't been doing it. And that's unfortunate. Some have, but a lot of people haven't.
Principal Scientific Advisor K. Vijay Raghavan's office. While droplets fall within 2 meters from an infected person, smaller aerosol particles are carried in the air up to 10 meters. On Today I Learned to the Print, we talk about aerosols. An aerosol is a suspension of extremely small liquid droplets or solid particles in the air. The aerosol material exists in the liquid or solid state and is carried by the air into the respiratory tract. Aerosols are generated from an individual when speaking, singing, coughing, or even just breathing, and can carry the virus if the person is infected. Droplets are 5 to 10 micrometers wide, while aerosols are less than 5 micrometers. The virus is just 0.1 micrometer wide. Both droplets and aerosols have the ability to carry viral loads, but aerosols can travel further, transmitting the virus over longer distances. For The Print, this is Pia Krishnankuti. For more, visit.
So, again, not to scare anybody, but just
subscribe.
Again, like, it's so amazing to me how this solid science, right, has just not transmitted, and there are still people who don't realize that COVID is an aerosol, right? The little mind boggling. Alrighty, I'm gonna stop there for today, and we'll just keep up with this lecture on Monday and do our activity then as well. And everybody have a great weekend. The weather's supposed to be absolutely lovely, so we won't be roasting ourselves. And thanks to everybody who was able to come on Zoom.